Spicy times, aren't they? Amid Ukraine striking Iranian assets in the Caspian Sea, high palace drama inside of Kyiv, and Ukrainian intelligence absolutely insisting that Russia is on the verge of mobilizing. A whole bunch of other stuff has been happening in the world, and your questions have been accumulating as a result. So today, it is time for some rapid-fire Q&A. I have tried to organize the questions in the usual manner. First Ukraine-Russia, then the Iran war, then other geopolitical hotspots, then the study of conflict, and finally, nonsense. So let's have some fun. Why hasn't Ukraine attacked Kaliningrad yet? Well, NATO countries frown on having Ukraine use their airspace to conduct an attack, as that is a bit too close to the war for their comfort. Side note, some of these restrictions often seem silly. Is it okay to give Ukraine a bomb? Sure. Is it okay for Ukraine to fly its own bombs over your country? Absolutely not. In any case, hitting Kaliningrad would require going around St. Petersburg, and at that point, you might as well just hit St. Petersburg. I could see a world where Ukraine tries this anyway to sow a little bit of panic in the exclave, but it is not a good idea from a purely military point of view. You necessarily would be going through an extra layer of defenses, and St. Petersburg has more valuable targets connected to the oil industry. You mentioned a few weeks ago in a video that Ukraine was better off only damaging the Kerch Strait bridge, as this would give Russia an incentive to end the war and regain its use. Can this be applied to other types of targets, such as oil refineries, infrastructure, and fruit-named logistics companies? Thank you for the $10 bribe. The strategic point that the question refers to is that simply destroying value on your opponent's side is not a good idea. You get coercive leverage from making acceptance of your demands look better than the alternative. Forever destroying value on the other side of the board just creates sunk costs for your opponent, which means that you have not actually changed their war strategy. What makes the refinery campaign different are two things. One, it does not take long for Russia to repair damaged refineries. That is why Ukraine keeps striking the same targets over and over again. Thus, almost as soon as the war ends, Russia can go back to making money. Same goes for Wildberries on this point. And two, the funds that Russia collects from oil receipts directly go into the war effort. Thus, this is not just a matter of imposing costs. It also alters the expected outcome of the war. Is there any realistic chance that China tries to take land from Russia at the end of the Ukraine war? It depends on how you define take. If Russia ends up very poor by the end of this, I do not think that it is crazy to suggest that China might want to purchase some of Russia's holdings in the East that, more than a century ago at this point, China felt unfairly fell in the hands of the Russian Empire. This is the time where I like to remind everyone crafting their own geopolitics fanfictions of Russia and China fighting a war over these territories, that war is costly, and negotiated settlements, like land purchases, leave everyone better off. Hello, Mr. Lines on Maps. With the recent successes of the Kiev Ukraine, and Russia slowly losing its allies, is there a way that Russia can still win the war? What would Russia have to do to achieve its original goal of conquering Ukraine? Sincerely, Victor Kevin from Massachusetts, not Vladimir Putin. Well, Victor Kevin, absent Vladimir Putin convincing his people to go along with at least doubling the size of the Russian footprint in Ukraine, I do not think that this is feasible. What is the airspeed and velocity of an unladen Swallow if launched from a Ukrainian naval drone? Given recent trends, seemingly fast enough to catch a couple of Wildberries. Can people in Russia order your book on Wildberries? I actually had to check on this because I was not sure. Obviously, they would not be selling my Ukraine-related ones, but my academic alter egos books were not there either. In a previous video, you answered my question and told me that the Houthis would not close the Bab-El-Mandeb Strait because they could not get support from Iran due to the closed airspace. But they closed the Bab. You lied to me. What gives? And thank you for the $10 bribe. The reason that the Houthis were not jumping at the chance to cause chaos around the Bab was because the Iran war had effectively shut down their main source of weapons shipments. But remember that where the current distribution of power lies has little direct effect on war versus peace outcomes. Rather, it dictates where the parties try to center their bargaining positions. Saudi Arabia, seeing weakness, tried to exploit the situation by renewing pressure against the Houthis and striking the capital's airport. So you have a situation where the Houthis were unwilling to exhaust scarce resources to help Iran, now willing to exhaust those resources to protect themselves, as they are in the middle of bargaining failure with Saudi Arabia. And further note here that the Houthis are trying to restrict the shutdown to Saudi passages. And indeed, traffic is only dropped by about a third to a half. The Bab is not closed, indicating that the Houthis do not want to turn this into something larger. Trump, by the way, may or may not care about that. Let's wait and see. It seems that the United States resumed strikes far lower on the escalation ladder, by volume, the target sets selected, and without help from Israel, whereas Iran resumed where it left off or went higher, target sets and help from Houthi proxies. Is there anything useful that we can infer from this? Can we infer something? Yes. Will it be useful? I am not sure. First, a corrective. Iran has not returned to its original drone and missile output from the beginning of the war. They may be getting close to what things looked like when the ceasefire was put into place, but that is a product of Iran's capabilities being significantly degraded. So the most that we can say here is that Iran may be trying very hard, but there is not much to try with. I would also not read much into what is happening with the Houthis, as I noted in the previous question that it is its own thing. The Trump administration has figured out that they look like the bad guys to both a ton of domestic constituents and would-be partners on the international stage. What we are seeing is an attempt to flip that script, trying to play a more reactionary role, and pin any continued trouble along the Strait of Hormuz on the Iranian government. I do not think that this will work in the short or medium term, but it is possible that it will work in the long term, even if this means that we are pushing the resolution of the crisis past the November midterm elections. It is unclear what Iran thinks it can get by keeping the strait closed other than revenue from charging a toll, and that is a far more unacceptable policy position for third-party leaders than anything that the United States has done since February 28th. To paraphrase Mike Ehrmantraut, whom you have also quoted, half measures generally result in less favorable end results for first actors. Examples of such being Putin annexing Crimea in 2014, only to wait 8 years before committing to a full-scale invasion, or Trump initiating an air campaign and gambling on an Iranian government collapse before a proper buildup of ground forces and air defenses had been completed, ultimately getting the US stuck between a rock and a hard place. With that in mind, would Trump benefit from escalating in Iran now, perhaps even to the point of a full-scale invasion, so as to end the war as soon as possible and restore traffic in the Strait? If so, why has the United States' official position seemingly been to stall in Iran, with a constant back and forth of peace talks and strikes? All of this stalling reminds me of a quote from Cicero: "More is lost by indecision than wrong decision." And thank you for the $20 bribe. As a more general point, I think we need to be careful about removing half measures from our geopolitical toolkits. It is much easier to remember when they fail than when they work. Regarding Iran specifically, I think the half measure is the more sensible option, at least for the time being. The goal at this point is to simply return to the status quo ex ante regarding Strait access. Iran cannot function as a country if it has no ability to export oil out of Hormuz. Per the previous couple of questions, a large-scale bombing campaign, not the targeted strikes from the past couple of weeks, but more along the lines of what happened during the initial period, is not helpful for trying to convince third parties that this is the way to go. And it also depletes US Tomahawk stockpiles, which is bad for a different reason. Boots on the ground, not special forces, but troops on a sustained offensive, would be completely disastrous for yet another reason, so I suspect that we will be sticking with the status quo for a while. What do you make of the claim that NATO was a mechanism for the United States to impose hegemony over Europe by controlling allied foreign policies? I think that it is a remarkable piece of disinformation, intended to sow discord into the internet discourse on the subject. And based on the frequency that I see this argument online, it has worked. If you have a friend who feels this way, ask them two things. 1. If this were true, would the United States want to constrain or encourage European defense spending? And 2, if European countries were being victimized in that fashion, would more of them want to join NATO, or would they all want to leave? The fact of the matter is that literally every single president of the United States since NATO's founding has begged Europe to take its continental security more seriously, and more or less they have not, to the frustration of Americans and European hawks alike. And the fact of the matter is that there has always been a waiting list to get into NATO, and no country has ever withdrawn, despite an exit option built into the treaty. This argument cannot even pass the sniff test, and it needs to be called out for the embarrassment that it is whenever you see it. What is more likely in your opinion? Russia invades a NATO state, China invades Taiwan, India and Pakistan nuke each other, or Half-Life 3 comes out? Well, one of those is impossible, and one of those we have seen does not necessarily happen even if the parties were at war with one another. The other two are correlated, and I would say that Russia is more likely to see China invading Taiwan as an opportunity to invade NATO rather than vice versa. So I would say Russia invading NATO is your answer. Regarding a potential future invasion of Taiwan, would the social conditioning of the Taiwanese public create a shifting balance of power that causes war, specifically by preparing the public to resist in the case that Taiwan is militarily conquered? Thank you for that $20 bribe. On the contrary, I think this would have a stabilizing effect. The apparent problem overall is that the PRC is growing more powerful right now, but the situation will flip in the long run as the mainland starts to have its demographics bite. As long as Beijing still sees the PRC growing more powerful over time, staging a war over Taiwan would be a bad idea. Then, the hope is that by the time the mainland's demographics start to fall off a cliff, trying to take over Taiwan would be prohibitively difficult, and so Beijing just accepts the reality of the situation. Another way to think about it is that shifting power only causes war when the declining power falls off by a large amount. But if the rising power, Taiwan in this case, starts off strong, then the PRC goes from being unlikely to take the island to slightly more unlikely to take the island. That does not trigger the required large shift in the balance of power to cause war, and so one hopes that everything passes peacefully. Australia and Fiji have just signed a mutual defense agreement called the Ocean of Peace Alliance, and New Zealand is currently considering membership. How concerned do you think China will be by the prospect of a nascent South Pacific NATO forming? If New Zealand joins, how much of a barrier does this present to the United States potentially joining in the future, given their anti-nuclear policies? This was another $10 donation in Kiwi dollars, the tastiest of dollars, so thank you for that. I suspect that China will take this in stride for now. There used to be a Southeast Asia version of NATO called CETO, but it did not have much buy-in from its members, and so it fell apart. Insert reminder here that the piece of paper itself is less important than creating actual enforcement mechanisms. The critical difference between now and 70 years ago is that the region views China as a serious threat, so you could imagine that there will be a more uniting force behind it. As for the nuclear question, I do not think it will matter much, as the United States can just participate without that part of its military. What is the United Kingdom's place on the world stage? Statements from the British press like to talk about the UK taking more responsibility within NATO, for example. However, at least publicly available information suggests that the UK has no specialization to uniquely excel in. It is not the only nuclear power within NATO. Its ground, air, and land forces are not unique in terms of capability. It does produce high-quality systems, such as engines from Rolls-Royce or missiles from MBDA UK, but other nations within NATO produce those as well. And would you believe that there was another 10 behind this question, this time in the form of pounds? Thank you for that bribe. Two main points here. One is that having completely unique capabilities within NATO is overrated. Just being one of 2 nuclear weapon states within Allied Europe is a big deal. Sure, France is there as well, but just think about how thankful the rest of the continent would be that British nuclear weapons are a thing if the far right ever wins the French presidency. Or never mind what happens if Russia figures out a way to disable France's arsenal. Uncorrelated overlap is very helpful. The other thing is that the United Kingdom has a very strong intelligence apparatus, thanks in large part to the Crown's colonial legacy. It is on par with much larger countries like Russia and China. Also thanks in part to that colonial legacy, the United Kingdom can cover areas that the United States cannot. Again, uncorrelated overlap is very helpful. So the United Kingdom is a key player in NATO despite your concerns. Crisis bargaining theory argues that wars arise from bargaining failures caused by private information, incentives to misrepresent that information, and commitment problems. Given the long-term decline in interstate warfare, to what extent do you think technological advances in intelligence, surveillance, and communication have reduced these bargaining failures? Do you believe that trend will continue? Or are commitment problems and strategic deception fundamentally irreducible, implying that war will always be possible? Unfortunately, I would say that we have only gotten better at the actual bargaining part at the margins as a species. Rather, I would ascribe most of the increase in peaceful relations over time to the growing costs of war, which result in safer demands under most bargaining frictions. But this is not an accident either. We have intentionally structured our economic relations for this purpose. It has worked well overall, see European relations, even if we are watching a counterexample with Russia right now. The bad news is that, no, we are not marching toward a state of perpetual peace. This game theory stuff is certainly interesting, but is it useful for making any predictions regarding outcomes? Or is your guess as good as everyone else's? I would say that this method of understanding international security primarily helps us explain why things happen, which does provide some leverage in understanding what will happen. One of the first lessons you learn in crisis bargaining theory is that we, as observers, do not see nearly enough to know what is happening, especially when the actors themselves do not see nearly enough to know what is happening. If all that does for us is reject the overconfidence that you will see from some geopolitical analysts, that is a major win in my book. Aside from that, we can help correct for the over- and underhyping we get from the media. For example, in the last year, it was painfully obvious that something was happening in Venezuela. It was also painfully obvious that there was going to be no military confrontation over Greenland. It was also painfully obvious that the United States was not about to attack Iran when the crisis first started. And all it took to understand that was to follow where the costly signals were being paid. Tap the sign. You have mentioned that you have connections to policymakers and that they watch your videos and send you emails. Does this influence you in the way that you make your videos? It does, at the margins, as it reminds me that I have to maintain some level of responsibility here. Every now and then, someone with at least some small policy-making capacity tells me that they saw video X, and then I have to pause for a moment to ask myself whether I may have helped or hurt the situation. I do not want to claim that I am fundamentally altering any geopolitical policies, but when what you do matters on the margins, you would prefer those be on the positive margins, not the negative margins. Is it true that you are motivated by money in your own question-choosing process? A question fittingly accompanied by a $20 donation. Thank you for that. There is a selection effect here in that people with good questions tend to be willing to pair them with donations. Someone who does not put much thought in a question is less likely to go through the trouble and expense. You will notice from today's video that donations do not mean that the question is a good fit for a full-length video, so there are no guarantees that come with the bribe. To draw an analogy, you might not know this, but the displays that you see at the end of aisles at supermarkets are not random. The companies that make the corresponding products actually paid the retailer to put them there. At first, this seems bad for consumers, but there is actually a subtle benefit here. The producer has private information about the quality of their products. Those with private signals of high quality want to get the initial product into the hands of consumers because they expect that the consumers will be happy and become recurring customers. Thus, the end display is a costly signal of the product's quality. And similarly, the bribes are a costly signal of the question's quality. Why aren't you more well known? I have been listening and watching since 2021, but I have never seen you on CNN, PBS, BBC, or any other major outlet as an expert. I get maybe 1 or 2 interview requests like that per week. As a general rule, I turn them down. I have never sought to be a public figure and do not really have much interest in it. Doing interviews like that are time-consuming, usually pay nothing, and do not convert viewers to monetizable things as well as you might think. I would much rather, and do, spend my time volunteering discussing crisis bargaining with policymakers. Can lines on maps explain the offside rule? I know that this is going to come off as American lectures the rest of the world about their beautiful game, but here goes. If I were master of the universe, I would add 2 lines to the pitch, each expanding the existing ends of the penalty box out to the sidelines. Once the ball enters that area, there is no more offsides. It is an offensive zone, and we should be promoting offense in it. 1-0 games are boring, and I want to be entertained. Hockey, for example, got infinitely more watchable after they removed the 2-line pass rule. And while I am here, the MLS's original version of penalty kicks is way better than the standard setup. A penalty kick does not even look like the normal game, and there is 0 on-the-fly thinking involved. Meanwhile, the MLS's abandon system, where the ball was live and the offensive player could touch it up to 3 times, actually leads to interactive gameplay. Why penalties exist in the way that they do baffles me, because they have always been like that, has been, and always will be an atrocious argument. I'm going through a divorce, and I experience your war is costly insight on a daily basis. Because of your videos, my new strategy is to ask my lawyer what the expected outcome of a trial is, and try to negotiate around that. Thanks for the divorce advice. Well, trials are costly, so in principle there exists a range of settlements that both sides prefer to it. I have an abnormally large number of friends who are attorneys, and they keep telling me that way too much of their jobs consists of convincing their own clients that, no, escalating this to a trial is a bad idea. I suspect that your attorney thinks that you are a dream client. Please explain realism and bargaining frictions with Bane's nuclear takeover of Gotham in The Dark Knight Rises. I will be honest, I've only seen that movie once, and I cannot remember the details well enough. As someone who now lives in Pittsburgh and has stepped on the field where Hines Ward was standing at the time of that particular incident, I should probably feel shame for not providing a better answer here. In science fiction, when aliens invade, usually the countries of Earth put aside their differences to unite against the invaders. Do you think this would actually happen? Basically, every situation with common values in international relations is plagued by freerider problems. I do not see an alien invasion being any different. Actually, that is one of the aspects of the movie Arrival that I appreciate. It treats international cooperation as a problem to be solved, rather than everyone being magically overcome by their love for humanity. Oh, and I guess non-zero-sum game being a pivotal line in the film did not hurt. And that happy note seems like a good place to stop for today. So if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.